This is the recording for the lecture entitled Democracy Today on Democratic Autonomy. The final two chapters in our textbook are the culmination of the argument which David Held has been developing throughout the book. In them, he sums up his thinking on democracy and offers his own model in response to both perceived inadequacies and in the traditional models and the challenge to democracy represented by contemporary developments. One particularly valuable thing about Chapter 10, the focus for this video, is that it summarizes many of the important points in the earlier chapters of the textbook. So this video will provide an overview of democratic autonomy. So these final two chapters are about what Held believes democracy could look like in our society today. The important thing to note here, however, is that David Held's own model actually has two sides. The first is a conception of democratic autonomy within the nation state itself, and the second is about the complementary structure of what he calls cosmopolitan democracy, which occurs at the regional and global levels. So democratic autonomy is Model 10A, and it's about democracy within the nation state. Now, in this model, David Held is thinking through, starting from first principles, he's thinking through what a genuinely democratic version of our society and political system might look like. He then outlines a set of practices and institutions that would be needed to bring it into being. And he attempts to integrate some of the most valuable ideas from the classic and contemporary models of democracy from earlier in the textbook, while avoiding their weaknesses. So he's trying to pull in the strengths from those previous models to create something new. He goes beyond many of the previous accounts of democracy by extending their scope to the inequalities associated with race, gender, family life, and so on. He makes the case for the return of a more active conception of citizenship within a broader account of the political sphere. And he takes on board the meaning of new technological advances for the possibilities of representation and democracy more general. So maybe using technological advances to improve participation and deliberation, that kind of thing. But basically what he's proposing is a plan for how contemporary democracy could be extended, how it could be deepened, and how it could be made real. So Chapter 10 starts with a discussion of the continuing appeal of democracy. Why are we still talking about democracy so much? He then goes on to outline the principle of autonomy as being at the center of democracy and as anchoring a new model of democracy, which he calls democratic autonomy. So, democracy basically is continuing to appeal to most people because we all really want to have our interests represented and our voices heard. And we need a way of making that happen. Democracy is generally seen as a mechanism or a tool that allows for participation, allows for representation, and allows for accountability. And in doing so, that mechanism helps to make decisions legitimate in the eyes of citizens. Now, Held's view is that democracy provides a form of politics and life in which there are fair and just ways of making decisions and negotiating values and value-oriented disputes. The idea of democracy is important because it encapsulates or captures the values of liberty, equality, and justice, and it brings it together into one concept. It can also be a guiding orientation to help navigate between different positions and beliefs. Now, the principle of autonomy is important here. Held builds on the ideas of both liberalism and Marxism in this conception. And he illustrates the common sense of aspirations that underlie these apparently contradictory worldviews in order to develop his principle of autonomy. Now, the idea of autonomy is the idea that human beings are able to reason self-consciously, be self people's ability to deliberate, to judge, to choose, and to act upon different possible actions, both private life and public life. This idea of an autonomous person would not be able to develop if political rights are simply tied to things like property rights or to religious traditions. So you need to broaden this conception of rights. Similarly, the idea of autonomous persons could not develop if a person's political identity and rights are tied to their social categories, such as male versus female, black versus white, native versus foreigner, or based on their status. So, lord versus serf, property owner versus worker, rich versus poor, those kinds of things. Now, thinkers along the political spectrum from left until to all the way to the from right until left. Anyway, all along the political spectrum, these thinkers all share various forms of the idea of autonomy as being important to democracy. Since the time of John Locke, the idea of liberalism has connected the goals of liberty and equality to individualistic political, economic, and ethical doctrines. In this view, the role of the state or the government is to simply provide the conditions that allow individual citizens to pursue their own interests. So the rule of law is intended to protect the individual's liberty to pursue their own interests without imposing any particular vision of what makes a good life on anyone else. So this means there needs to be a restricted or narrow state or government to allow for autonomous people to pursue their own interests. The new rights approach is to focus on reducing arbitrary power and regulatory capacity to its lowest possible point. Socialist thinkers also believe in the principle of autonomy, but they look for ways to allow for both the free development of each person and the free development of all people together. In other words, they try to find a way to balance personal autonomy with the need for collectivism so that we can all work together to create a strong society. Now, all of these positions aspire to a world that is characterized by free and equal relations among mature adults. To do so, there is a shared set of aspirations that can help clarify the proper relationship between the sovereign state and sovereign people. Now, these aspirations are linked by the concept of autonomy. Each aspiration is based on certain assumptions about how people will act. So, here are our assumptions. Number one is the creation of the best circumstances for all humans to develop their nature and express their diverse qualities. So this involves an assumption of respect for individuals' diverse capacities, their diverse abilities to learn and to enhance their potential. The second point is about the protection from the arbitrary use of political authority and coercive power. So this involves an assumption of respect for privacy and everything which are not the basis of potential and demonstrable harm to others. So we can respect people's individual privacy as long as it doesn't harm other people. The third point is about the involvement of citizens in the determination of the conditions of their association. So this means basically there's an assumption of respect for the capacity of individuals to come to reasoned standpoints, the capacity of people to actually think about what they want and use the information they have to come to a decision. So if we're going to involve citizens in determining their role in society, there has to be this respect. The fourth point is about the expansion of economic opportunity to maximize the availability of resources. This involves an assumption that when individuals, people are free from the burdens of unmet physical needs, so as long as you help them not to be poor, basically, they are better able to realize their goals or their ends, their role in life. As long as people have their ability to start from a level playing field, basically, then they're better able to participate in democracy. So Hell takes these aspirations to write this general principle of autonomy, which says persons should enjoy equal rights and accordingly equal obligations in the specification of the political framework which generates and limits opportunities available to them. That is, people should be free and equal in the processes of deliberation about the conditions of their own lives and in the determination of these conditions, as long as they don't negate the rights of others, as long as they don't harm other people. So that's the basic general principle of autonomy that informs Held's model of democratic autonomy. Now, Held is using insights from both liberalism and Marxism and developmental republicanism in his discussion of these questions. From liberalism comes a strong emphasis on the rights of citizens and a pluralist distrust of undue concentrations of power. So we don't want to have the opportunity for abuse of power if it's concentrated in the hands of just a few people. There's an insistence on the state, on the idea that the state must be separated from civil society, that its powers have to be carefully delineated or specified, and that its agencies have to be democratically controlled. From Marxism comes an acceptance of the essential connection between economic and political power, and an understanding that the ownership and control of productive and financial systems leads to a disproportionate influence on the supposedly democratic political agenda. So Marxism is about this idea that we can't have power concentrated in the hands of those who own the productive systems and the financial systems and so on. Now, on page 268 of the textbook, there's a table outlining the central tenets of these three democratic models: developmental republicanism, liberalism, and Marxism. So this provides a good overview of these three models, but Held is using this table as a way of reflecting on the fundamental positions of these theories, because he says this is the best way to really understand the principle of autonomy. So the principle of autonomy means that we need to recognize that the skepticism about power, that each of the three models have complement each other. So republicanism, skepticism, that's a hard word to say. Republicanism, skepticism about the power of princes and monarchs. Liberalism, skepticism about concentrated power in any form. And then Marxism, tongue twister. Marxism, skepticism about economic power. That's number one. By looking at each of the key positions for each model, we can also think about the limitations that each model has that need to be taken into account. So each of these models talk about the need for some form of civil society that includes participation in the polity, but none of the three really explore the barriers to participation in democratic life. And so part of the problem is that there's a fairly narrow definition of what the political means. So this is where we talk about how much should the state be separated from civil society, that kind of thing. We can also think about how much freedom and participation are linked together, and what is the desirable form of the state, and so on. We can also look at what laws need to be in place in order to protect citizens, make sure that the common good is kept in mind or not, and so on. We can also look at how civic greatness depends on citizens' involvement in a free way of life, or should some spaces, like private space, be enshrined in the law to allow for individual autonomy and initiative, and so on. And then, of course, we also need to consider the economics of the situation. So what Held is really doing here is highlighting 5 problems. There's the economic problem that's identified by Marxists and others of the unequal distribution of property, wealth, and power under liberal democracy, and the way individual legal and political rights are weakened by the lack of economic growth. The second problem is um, the related problem with the state under modern capitalism, in that its freedom of action and hence the possibility of genuine democratic control over the policy agenda can be curtailed by corporate power. Right? If corporations have too much economic power, then it can impact on democratic control. The third major problem, or other major problem with the state, that's identified the liberal critics of socialism and of collectivism more generally, is regarding protecting the rights of the individual and policing the frontiers of freedom against overwhelming concentrations of power, and a sense of self-interested bureaucracy. So this fear of big government, is among the liberal critics of socialism. Fourth is the problem in civil society that tends to be neglected by most traditional schools of political thought, about the way that inequalities related to gender and race, that are often linked to economic inequalities, tend to infringe on the claims of citizenship. So when there's inequalities, are you able to really be a good citizen? And then the fifth problem is that of legitimacy, in particular, what happens when there's apathy and non-participation by a large minority of citizens. What does that do to the legitimacy of the government? Now, Hell's answer to these five problems is to identify autonomy as the core principle of democracy, as being something that underlies all other principles of democracy. And then from this principle of autonomy, he proposes a political system that he believes is more democratic. But it does rely on an extensive set of conditions of enactment. And so the principle itself has to take precedence over any subsidiary aspect of democracy. For example, the unqualified right to participation, or an absolute equality of treatment, or unlimited freedom, or anything like that. You can't put anything else before this principle of autonomy. I'm going to stop here just to break up this recording, and so stay tuned for another recording.